The deadly betrayal at Yorktown sealed the fate of Charles Cornwallis and his army, when nearly 10,000 British soldiers were trapped and compelled to surrender in October 1781, a disaster that marked the decisive turning point in Britain's war for America. What unfolded on the Virginia Peninsula was not simply a battlefield defeat, but the collapse of a broader imperial strategy, in which assumptions of naval supremacy, reliance on loyalist support, and the expectation of coordinated command all failed at once. Yorktown became the site where Britain's effort to maintain control over its rebellious colonies unraveled under the pressure of Franco-American alliance and the weight of logistical miscalculation. The American War of Independence had dragged on for 6 years by the time Cornwallis fortified himself at Yorktown. Britain had committed enormous resources, tens of thousands of troops, fleets ranging from the Caribbean to Canada, and vast sums of money raised through loans and taxation, to suppress a rebellion that began in 1775 at Lexington and Concord. The rebellion, once thought containable within Massachusetts, spread across 13 colonies, drawing in France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic, and transforming what began as a colonial uprising into a global war. By 1781, Britain faced conflict not only in North America, but across the Caribbean, in the Mediterranean, and in the waters of the Indian Ocean. Yorktown emerged as a decisive theater precisely because the empire's resources were stretched thin. Charles Cornwallis, a career officer educated at Eton and Cambridge and seasoned in European campaigns before 1776, had become one of Britain's most prominent generals in the Americas. His reputation was built in part on his willingness to enforce discipline and his ability to command troops effectively in challenging terrain. Yet his reliance on assumptions about loyalist support, British naval dominance, and reinforcements from New York exposed him to a chain of vulnerabilities. At Yorktown, these assumptions collided with new realities. The French Navy's capacity to contest British control of the Atlantic, George Washington's political and military skill in forging alliances, and the fragile morale of British and German troops isolated in Virginia. The concept of betrayal at Yorktown did not lie in treachery within Cornwallis's own command, but in the betrayal of expectation, the unshakable confidence that Britain's imperial structure could not fail. Cornwallis, like his superiors in London and commanders in New York, believed that the Royal Navy's dominance of the seas was assured. Throughout the 18th century, Britain's naval supremacy had been the linchpin of its military power, enabling the projection of force across oceans, the protection of commerce, and the rapid redeployment of troops. The expectation that ships could supply, reinforce, or evacuate garrisons was fundamental to Britain's global system. At Yorktown, when those ships did not appear, the entire edifice crumbled. For the Franco-American forces, Yorktown became the opportunity to reverse years of frustration and stalemate. Washington, who had endured winters at Valley Forge and a string of defeats earlier in the war, recognized that only with French support could he secure a decisive victory. When Admiral François-Joseph Paul, Comte de Grasse, sailed from the Caribbean to the Chesapeake with a fleet of 28 ships of the line, the strategic balance shifted. Cornwallis's expectation of relief from the sea turned into isolation. The betrayal of imperial confidence was not the result of a single act of duplicity, but of compounded misjudgments that left Britain's most capable field commander in America surrounded on land and blockaded by sea. The numbers at Yorktown conveyed the scale of the disaster. Cornwallis's army, consisting of approximately 7,000 British regulars, 3,000 German auxiliaries, mostly from Hesse Castle and Brunswick, and several hundred loyalist militia, represented the largest concentration of imperial forces in Virginia. Opposing him were nearly 17,000 Franco-American troops, about 8,800 Americans under Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette, and 8,000 French soldiers under the Comte de Rochambeau. Once the French fleet controlled the Chesapeake, these forces converged on Yorktown in September 1781, establishing siege lines that cut Cornwallis off from both retreat and reinforcement. The consequences of this convergence were severe. As artillery batteries closed in and supply shortages worsened, Cornwallis faced the slow erosion of both his defenses and the morale of his men. Disease spread rapidly through crowded encampments. Food dwindled as the besieging armies cut off external sources. Efforts to maintain discipline faltered under constant bombardment and dwindling hope of relief. The surrender on October 19th was not an isolated moment of capitulation, but the culmination of weeks of collapse, set in motion by a series of misplaced assumptions that had structured Britain's southern campaign. Yorktown's significance was recognized immediately by contemporaries. To the American revolutionaries, it signaled that independence was no longer a distant possibility, but an attainable reality. To France, it validated years of financial and military investment against Britain, demonstrating that combined arms operations on land and sea could defeat the world's foremost imperial power. In Britain, the surrender resonated as a shocking reversal, provoking debate in Parliament and accelerating a political crisis at home. Cornwallis, who had expected to play a decisive role in suppressing rebellion, became instead the symbol of imperial loss. The disaster at Yorktown cannot be understood in isolation. It was the product of years of shifting strategy, earlier campaigns across the Carolinas, the complex dynamics of loyalist and patriot allegiances, and the decisions of British ministers who sought to balance continental war in Europe with imperial conflict overseas. Cornwallis's position in Virginia reflected the broader trajectory of Britain's southern strategy, a plan that initially promised to stabilize the war, but left its field armies exposed to attrition, insurgency, and the hazards of overextension. To see how Cornwallis reached Yorktown, and why he believed his position defensible, requires retracing his path through earlier campaigns in the South, where victories at Camden and Guilford Courthouse built his reputation while simultaneously entangling him in the weaknesses of Britain's strategic design. It was there, in the Carolinas, that Cornwallis forged the approach that he carried into Virginia, an approach that would encounter both fleeting success and mounting constraint. Charles Cornwallis entered the American War of Independence with a pedigree that made him both valuable and visible within Britain's military hierarchy. Born into the English aristocracy in 1738 as the eldest son of Charles, 1st Earl Cornwallis, he was educated at Eton and Clare College, Cambridge, before taking a commission in the Grenadier Guards. His service during the 7 Years' War included combat at Minden in 1759 and staff duty on the continent, experiences that provided him with familiarity in European-style warfare and exposure to the professional armies of the era. By the time the American colonies rose in rebellion, Cornwallis had already acquired a reputation as a disciplined officer, skilled in tactical command, and unafraid of close engagement with his men. When hostilities erupted in 1775, Cornwallis was dispatched across the Atlantic with the rank of Major General. He arrived in America in early 1776, just as British forces under General William Howe launched their campaign to secure New York. Cornwallis distinguished himself at the Battle of Long Island in August 1776, where the British flanking maneuver routed Washington's Continental Army and forced the Americans into a retreat across the Hudson. Cornwallis's pursuit of the retreating forces into New Jersey demonstrated his energy and reliability, though it also exposed him to the limits of British endurance in hostile territory. Washington's counterstroke at Trenton in December, when Hessian auxiliaries were surprised and defeated, reminded Cornwallis that victory in America was not a matter of professional armies alone, but of managing vast distances, unpredictable conditions, and a determined insurgent opponent. Over the following years, Cornwallis remained one of the central figures in Britain's campaigns. He fought at Brandywine in September 1777, where British forces defeated Washington's army and opened the road to Philadelphia. Cornwallis led the decisive flanking column across the Brandywine Creek, applying lessons from his European training to American terrain. Later that autumn, he participated in the Battle of Germantown, again demonstrating his reliability under Howe's command. These engagements underscored his value as a field commander who could execute complex maneuvers with efficiency. Yet the broader war effort was already showing signs of strategic strain, with the surrender of Burgoyne's army at Saratoga in October 1777 convincing France to enter the war. Cornwallis's personal circumstances briefly drew him back to England in 1778, following the death of his wife Jemima. His return, however, was short-lived. By 1779, the war had expanded, with French fleets challenging Britain in the Atlantic and Spanish entry into the conflict widening the imperial commitments. In America, the center of gravity shifted toward the south, where Britain hoped Loyalist sympathizers could stabilize control and where economic interests, particularly rice, indigo, and access to Caribbean trade routes, were considered vital. Cornwallis was ordered to Charleston, South Carolina, where he assumed a prominent role under Sir Henry Clinton, the commander-in-chief. The Siege of Charleston in the spring of 1780 offered Cornwallis a platform for renewed distinction. With Clinton directing operations, Cornwallis led field detachments that cut off American reinforcements and secured the approaches to the city. When Charleston capitulated in May 1780, with over 5,000 American troops surrendering, it represented the largest single British victory of the war. Cornwallis was left in command of the Southern Theater once Clinton returned to New York. The assignment placed him at the center of Britain's hopes for recovery, yet it also burdened him with immense responsibility in a region marked by fluid allegiances, difficult geography, and an enemy increasingly adept at irregular warfare. The summer of 1780 tested Cornwallis's capacity to impose order on the Carolinas. In August, he commanded British forces at the Battle of Camden, where his 2,200 men faced an American army under General Horatio Gates numbering approximately 3,700. The confrontation ended in a decisive British victory, with the Americans suffering catastrophic losses. Over 1,000 killed or wounded and another 1,000 captured. Cornwallis's deployment of regular troops against inexperienced militia proved devastating, and Camden briefly bolstered the perception that the Southern strategy could succeed. Yet victory also carried complications. The brutality of the battlefield, coupled with subsequent reprisals against suspected rebels, inflamed resistance rather than subdued it. Guerrilla leaders such as Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens began to mobilize local fighters, striking at supply lines, ambushing detachments, and eroding British control of the countryside. Cornwallis pressed deeper into the Carolinas despite these challenges, seeking to bring the region firmly under imperial control. In March 1781, he faced a larger American army under Nathanael Greene at Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina. Cornwallis commanded roughly 1,900 men, while Greene fielded nearly 4,500. The battle, fought in dense woodland, was fierce and chaotic. Cornwallis ordered volleys of grapeshot into mixed combat lines, an action that inflicted heavy casualties, but also endangered his own men. When the smoke cleared, the British held the field, but they had lost over 500 men, nearly a quarter of their force. Greene, though retreating, preserved his army, while Cornwallis's losses weakened his capacity to continue sustained operations. The aftermath of Guilford Courthouse illustrated the paradox of Cornwallis's command: tactical victories that produced strategic strain. His army was increasingly reliant on tenuous supply lines stretching back to the coast. Loyalist support, while significant in pockets, failed to materialize on the scale British planners had anticipated. For every Loyalist militia that joined his cause, Patriot partisans rose in equal or greater numbers. Disease, desertion, and the constant need for provisions compounded the difficulties. Cornwallis's correspondence with Clinton reflected frustration over the imbalance between expectation and reality, and his decision to shift operations into Virginia reflected a search for fresh ground where he might sever the arteries of the rebellion. Cornwallis's reputation in Britain remained that of a capable officer who could be trusted with independent command, yet his position in America grew precarious. Each victory drained his army further, and each advance into new territory stretched his resources thinner. The Southern Theater, envisioned as the key to restoring imperial authority, had become a landscape of attrition and elusive control. Cornwallis pressed forward into Virginia, convinced that striking at its agricultural wealth and commercial lifelines would cripple the rebellion. But his movements also exposed him to new vulnerabilities and a convergence of adversaries waiting to exploit them. By 1778, British ministers and commanders recognized that operations in the northern colonies had failed to deliver decisive results. The rebellion, once expected to collapse under pressure from professional armies, had persisted despite the capture of key cities such as New York and Philadelphia. With French intervention expanding the conflict into a global struggle, London sought a new approach. Attention shifted southward, where officials believed the balance of allegiance favored the crown and where economic resources promised greater leverage. Rice, indigo, naval stores, and access to ports along the southern coastline were judged critical not only for sustaining the colonies, but also for feeding Britain's wider imperial system. The southern colonies were thought to contain a higher proportion of loyalists than New England or the mid-Atlantic. Governors, merchants, planters, and settlers with strong economic and cultural ties to Britain were expected to provide manpower once regular forces arrived to reassert control. British officials envisioned a chain of cooperation. Regular troops would seize urban centers and secure supply depots, loyalist militias would stabilize rural areas, and the rebellion would fracture under pressure from within. This plan, often referred to as the Southern Strategy, promised to conserve resources by leveraging local support while still applying professional force at critical points. In practice, the strategy exposed deep misjudgments. Allegiance in the South proved volatile and localized, shaped by kinship ties, frontier rivalries, and personal grievances. Many loyalists who did take up arms faced retaliation from neighbors, while patriot partisans launched irregular campaigns that made control of the countryside elusive. The region's geography compounded the problem. Swamps, forests, and rivers created ideal conditions for guerrilla warfare. Regular troops, burdened by baggage trains and dependent on supply lines from the coast, found themselves vulnerable to constant harassment. Cornwallis became the instrument of this strategy after Charleston's fall in 1780. With Clinton withdrawing to New York to manage broader operations, Cornwallis inherited both the opportunities and the liabilities of Southern command. His task was to convert battlefield victories into political stability, yet the very measures required to impose order inflamed resistance. The victory at Camden demonstrated the potency of disciplined regulars against inexperienced militia, but it also revealed the brittleness of loyalist mobilization. Many of those who had rallied to British arms deserted after facing Patriot reprisals or doubted Britain's capacity to protect them in remote areas. The problem was not one of battlefield skill, but of strategic alignment. Cornwallis could defeat organized armies, but every march through the countryside left behind a wake of resentment and renewed insurgency. British detachments sent to pacify rural districts often faced ambushes from small Patriot bands, who avoided open battle but inflicted steady attrition. The executions of captured loyalists by Patriot militias deepened the cycle of vengeance, while British reprisals, including the destruction of property, reinforced perceptions of occupation rather than liberation. Nathaniel Greene's arrival as commander of the Continental Forces in the South intensified these dynamics. Greene, though often avoiding direct confrontation, perfected a strategy of maneuver and dispersal that kept Cornwallis in constant motion. By dividing his forces into smaller detachments, Greene forced the British to spread their efforts across wide areas, while partisans under men like Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter ensured that no stretch of countryside remained quiet for long. Cornwallis's army, while capable of seizing towns and winning set-piece engagements, became increasingly tied down in a war of endurance that eroded its strength. The Southern strategy had also been conceived with the expectation of secure naval support. Britain's navy did indeed transport troops efficiently and supply coastal bases such as Charleston and Savannah. Yet inland operations extended far beyond the reach of maritime logistics. Wagons struggled over rough terrain, horses died from disease and overwork, and provisions were often requisitioned from a hostile population. Every mile of advance deepened dependence on supply lines vulnerable to ambush. Cornwallis pressed forward in search of decisive engagements that might break the rebellion, but each step drew him further from reliable support. Another complication arose from the international dimensions of the war. French involvement meant that every resource Britain diverted to America competed with demands in the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, and European waters. French fleets posed a constant threat to Britain's control of the seas, while Spain's entry into the conflict in 1779 further stretched imperial commitments. Cornwallis, operating deep in the southern interior, was not only constrained by local resistance, but by the shifting priorities of a global war in which reinforcements and supplies could not always be guaranteed. The Southern strategy, conceived as a means of regaining momentum, became a war of attrition across a fragmented landscape. Cornwallis pressed from one battle to the next, victorious at Camden, bloodied at Guilford Courthouse, frustrated in his pursuit of Greene's elusive forces. Each engagement imposed costs out of proportion to the gains achieved. The British controlled the ground where they stood, but their hold dissolved as soon as they moved on. By 1781, the hopes invested in Southern loyalism had faded into a grim recognition that support was patchy and unreliable. Cornwallis's decision to march into Virginia reflected both ambition and necessity. The Carolinas had drained his army without producing decisive results, and he judged Virginia to be the rebellion's logistical heart. By targeting its resources, depots, and communications, he hoped to cripple the capacity of the Continental forces to continue fighting. Virginia also offered access to deep water ports, which, if secured, might allow sustained connection with the Royal Navy and more direct reinforcement from New York. The move represented both a continuation of the Southern strategy and a departure from its assumptions, for Cornwallis increasingly relied on concentration of regular force rather than dispersed Loyalist cooperation. As Cornwallis shifted northward, he carried with him an army still capable of disciplined action, but increasingly weary from months of marching and fighting. His command decisions reflected a constant balancing act between the expectations of London, the directives of Clinton, and the realities on the ground. The Southern strategy had promised a pathway to restoring imperial control through Loyalist support and economic leverage. Instead, it had left Cornwallis searching for secure ground amid widening conflict, compelled to adapt his approach in ways that would place him squarely in Virginia, exposed to converging enemies, and dependent on assumptions that were about to be tested under far harsher conditions. When Cornwallis directed his army into Virginia in the spring of 1781, it was less a fresh campaign than an extension of the burdens he had carried through the Carolinas. His decision was influenced by both necessity and pressure from his superior, Sir Henry Clinton, who believed that Virginia's role as a supply center for the rebellion made it a decisive theater. By concentrating British forces there, Clinton argued, the insurgency's logistical foundation could be destroyed. Cornwallis accepted the directive, though not without misgivings, for he was moving into territory where local resistance was strong and where coordination with naval power was critical. Virginia's size and wealth gave it strategic importance out of proportion to its distance from earlier campaigns. With its fertile river valleys, vast tobacco plantations, and proximity to Chesapeake Bay, the colony served as a reservoir of supplies for Continental forces across the South. Privateers operated from its waterways, harassing British shipping and disrupting commerce. To Cornwallis, striking at Virginia promised both to relieve pressure in the Carolinas and to weaken Greene's elusive army by cutting off its sources of reinforcement. Yet the very features that made the colony valuable also made it difficult to control. Its extensive road network, though useful for rapid movement, also allowed Patriot detachments to disperse and reassemble with ease. The first months of operations revealed both opportunity and difficulty. Cornwallis coordinated with the notorious cavalry officer Banastre Tarleton, whose fast-moving raids devastated plantations and destroyed Patriot supply caches. Tarleton's column struck at Charlottesville in June, scattering the Virginia legislature and burning stores. Loyalist forces, however, remained hesitant, providing little of the widespread support anticipated in London. The countryside bristled with resentment, and Patriot leaders such as the young Marquis de Lafayette maneuvered cautiously but effectively to preserve their forces. Lafayette, commanding a contingent of about 3,000 Continental and militia troops, avoided direct battle with Cornwallis's larger force of nearly 7,000. Instead, he shadowed the British, retreating when threatened but striking opportunistically at isolated detachments. Cornwallis grew frustrated at the pattern of elusive opposition. His army, though capable of overwhelming Lafayette in open battle, could rarely pin him down. The long marches through Virginia's countryside drained supplies, and foraging expeditions exposed British soldiers to ambushes. The logistical tether stretched further as the army advanced, compelling Cornwallis to rely on naval support along the Chesapeake. He began to seek a defensible position where his army could operate in coordination with the fleet, a decision that would direct him toward the Tidewater region. The choice of Yorktown as a base stemmed from these calculations. Situated on a bluff overlooking the York River, the town offered access to deep water suitable for naval vessels, while its position on the peninsula between the York and James Rivers allowed interior operations into Virginia's heartland. Cornwallis believed fortifying Yorktown would provide a secure anchor from which to dominate the region and threaten American communications. He began entrenching in August 1781, ordering his engineers to construct a ring of redoubts, bastions, and earthworks around the settlement. Gloucester Point, across the river, was also fortified to protect the northern approach. The move to Yorktown reflected a shift in Cornwallis's posture. Rather than continuing the mobile pursuit of Greene and Lafayette, he concentrated his forces in anticipation of coordination with the Royal Navy. Cornwallis assumed that Britain's maritime strength would guarantee resupply and, if necessary, evacuation. This expectation was not unreasonable given Britain's dominance of the seas for much of the 18th century, yet it bound his fortunes to decisions and battles far beyond his immediate control. His army, once the most mobile and aggressive in the Southern theater, became anchored to a coastal fortress whose security depended on events at sea. Inside Virginia, the British presence triggered both alarm and mobilization. Local militias intensified their activities, and Lafayette received reinforcements that gradually expanded his capacity to contest Cornwallis's movements. French troops under the Marquis de Saint-Simon landed at Newport News in September, adding to the growing Franco-American concentration. Communication between Washington and Rochambeau, operating further north, revealed a convergence of opportunity. As Cornwallis dug in at Yorktown, his position transformed from an offensive base into a trap waiting to be closed. Yet from Cornwallis's perspective, the defenses appeared tenable. His engineers constructed multiple lines of entrenchments, mounting artillery to command the approaches. His force of British and German regulars remained disciplined, and the garrison at Gloucester Point secured his northern flank. Reports indicated that Clinton in New York planned to send reinforcements by sea, which, combined with the Royal Navy's expected superiority, would relieve any pressure. Cornwallis trusted in this imperial machinery, confident that his decision to anchor at Yorktown aligned with Britain's broader strategy. But uncertainty loomed. The naval balance in the Atlantic was shifting under French challenge, and the concentration of Franco-American forces on land was accelerating. Cornwallis's reliance on the Royal Navy left his fate tied to a theater of war over which he exercised no command. While his men fortified earthworks under the Virginia sun, American and French columns were marching southward, and French ships were gathering in the Caribbean with orders to sail to the Chesapeake. The walls rising around Yorktown gave the appearance of security, yet they enclosed an army that was becoming increasingly dependent on promises from the sea. Cornwallis's occupation of Yorktown was founded on the assumption that Britain's greatest instrument of power, the Royal Navy, would secure his position. For decades, naval dominance had been the foundation of Britain's global reach. Control of the Atlantic allowed for the transport of armies, the protection of commerce, and the reinforcement of garrisons thousands of miles from home. No British general in America could imagine prolonged operations without maritime support, and Cornwallis was no exception. His calculations at Yorktown rested on an unshakable expectation that British fleets would appear when summoned, bringing supplies, reinforcements, or evacuation if required. This confidence was not baseless. Since the War of Spanish Succession, British naval power had grown steadily, its dockyards producing ships at a pace unmatched by rivals. Victories against France during the 7 Years' War had cemented an image of near invulnerability at sea. By the late 1770s, Britain maintained over 100 ships of the line, while France's navy had lagged after years of neglect. London's ministers and commanders in America relied on this disparity when directing operations. Cornwallis's very deployment into Virginia assumed that supply lines through the Chesapeake could not be severed. The reality in 1781 diverged sharply from expectation. France, under the reforming leadership of the Comte de Sartine and later the Marquis de Castries at the Ministry of Marine, had rebuilt its fleet with remarkable speed. By concentrating resources and improving administration, the French Navy re-emerged as a formidable rival. The alliance with the American revolutionaries gave France both a political incentive and a strategic framework to contest Britain's control of the seas and stretch imperial resources across multiple theaters. French squadrons sailed from Brest, Toulon, and the Caribbean, targeting Britain's vulnerable choke points. Cornwallis could not have ignored these shifts, but from his vantage point the Royal Navy still appeared unassailable. Communications with Clinton in New York reinforced the belief that reinforcements could be dispatched when needed. Clinton himself assured Cornwallis in correspondence that the Navy would maintain superiority off the American coast. The presence of bases at New York and Charleston further seemed to guarantee British mobility along the seaboard. Entrusting his fate to the fleet, Cornwallis fortified Yorktown with the expectation that any siege could be relieved from the sea. The assumption extended beyond military calculation into imperial ideology. Britain's empire was constructed around the premise that maritime power gave it freedom of action unmatched by continental states. The Navy was not simply a military tool, but a symbol of the empire's resilience. To Cornwallis and many of his contemporaries, the notion that France could wrest control of the Chesapeake for even a short period seemed implausible. This belief amounted to a strategic blind spot, one that left Cornwallis vulnerable to developments far outside his immediate field of vision. While earthworks rose around Yorktown, a French fleet under Admiral François-Joseph Paul, Comte de Grasse, prepared to sail from the Caribbean. With 28 ships of the line, de Grasse carried orders to secure control of the Chesapeake, coordinate with Washington and Rochambeau, and cut Cornwallis off from relief. His fleet represented not only numerical strength, but the culmination of years of French reorganization. On August 30, 1781, de Grasse's ships entered the Chesapeake and began landing troops and supplies at Williamsburg, only a few miles from Cornwallis's position. The naval balance had shifted with startling speed. Cornwallis still believed relief was forthcoming. Dispatches from Clinton promised a fleet would sail from New York to support him, though delays and uncertainty plagued the effort. The British Admiral Thomas Graves eventually put to sea with 19 ships of the line, joined by reinforcements under Samuel Hood from the Caribbean. Yet coordination was haphazard, and intelligence about French movements was incomplete. When Graves reached the Chesapeake on September 5th, he found de Grasse's fleet already in position, blocking entry. The ensuing battle off the Virginia Capes exposed the gap between expectation and reality. De Grasse's fleet, better organized and numerically superior, engaged Graves in a running fight that lasted several hours. Neither side lost a ship, but the British were driven back, their line disordered, and their opportunity to break through lost. Graves withdrew to New York, leaving Cornwallis stranded. The Royal Navy's failure to dominate the Chesapeake represented the collapse of the very premise on which Cornwallis had based his occupation of Yorktown. What had been considered Britain's unassailable advantage now betrayed him through absence. Inside Yorktown, the consequences became immediately apparent. Without naval control, Cornwallis could no longer expect reinforcements or evacuation. Supplies dwindled as American and French forces tightened their grip. His soldiers, once assured that British sea power guaranteed their security, now faced the grim reality of isolation. The sense of betrayal extended beyond Cornwallis himself to every rank in his army, as the faith placed in imperial might gave way to uncertainty. The strategic assumption that naval superiority was permanent had unraveled in a matter of weeks. Cornwallis had entrenched at Yorktown believing the sea to be his lifeline, but the line had been cut. The betrayal of expectation was not a deliberate act of treachery, but the slow realization that reliance on an overstretched empire carried risks that no commander on the ground could repair. His defenses were intact, his men disciplined, and his artillery formidable, but all of these assets depended on the ability to connect with Britain's global machinery of war. That machinery had faltered, and the breach it created left Cornwallis facing converging armies without assurance of relief. As the French fleet maintained its blockade and American troops gathered in ever greater numbers, Yorktown ceased to be a base of operations and became a trap. The soil into which Cornwallis's men had dug their entrenchments was now the ground on which they would be compelled to stand, waiting for the storm of siege warfare to begin. The walls of earth, built in confidence of imperial reach, were about to be tested against the combined artillery of France and America, while Cornwallis's reliance on the Navy transformed into a vulnerability his enemies were prepared to exploit. While Cornwallis entrenched on the Yorktown Peninsula and trusted that the Royal Navy would provide relief, his opponents were orchestrating a movement of remarkable scale and deception. George Washington, commanding the Continental Army, had long sought an opportunity to deliver a decisive blow. For years, his forces had been stretched thin, shifting between defensive positions around New Jersey, New York, and the Hudson Valley. By 1781, however, the alliance with France provided him not only with troops but with the means to coordinate a campaign capable of trapping a major British force. The key lay in convincing the enemy that New York remained his principal objective, while quietly directing his army south toward Virginia. The French alliance had matured after years of coordination. In July 1780, a French expeditionary corps under Jean-Baptiste Donatien de Vimeur, Comte de Rochambeau, landed at Newport, Rhode Island. Composed of approximately 5,500 professional soldiers, well supplied and supported by artillery, this force represented a significant addition to Washington's army. For months, Washington pressed for combined operations against New York, where Clinton's headquarters offered a tempting target. Yet both men recognized the difficulty of storming heavily fortified defenses with limited naval support. The arrival of Admiral de Grasse's fleet in the summer of 1781 opened a new possibility. To strike in Virginia, where Cornwallis's position appeared strong but was vulnerable to blockade. Secrecy was essential. Washington's headquarters at New Windsor on the Hudson became the center of planning, with detailed maps and calculations prepared for the march. In mid-August 1781, Washington and Rochambeau agreed on the plan to shift their armies southward. To conceal their intentions, they spread rumors and conducted visible preparations for a potential attack on New York. Engineers surveyed Staten Island, wagons assembled near the Hudson, and correspondents hinted at a northern assault. Clinton, observing from his headquarters, interpreted these movements as confirmation that New York remained the focus. The reality was different. On August 19th, Washington's army of around 2,500 Continentals joined Rochambeau's 4,000 French soldiers, and the combined force began its march from Dobbs Ferry toward Philadelphia. The movement was executed with precision, columns of men advancing along dusty roads through New Jersey and Pennsylvania, accompanied by artillery, baggage trains, and supply wagons. Civilians watched as the Allied armies passed, the disciplined ranks of French troops in white coats contrasting with the varied attire of the Continental soldiers. Each day of the march required careful management of provisions, coordination of river crossings, and attention to morale. Washington himself rode at the head of the columns, embodying the determination that had carried the rebellion through 6 years of hardship. The march was not merely a logistical feat, but a psychological maneuver. Clinton remained convinced that New York was the target, only realizing the true objective when it was too late. Washington's skill and deception mirrored earlier episodes of the war, from the retreat across New Jersey in 1776 to the feints that concealed his movements at Trenton and Princeton. Now, deception was applied on a grander scale, with thousands of men moving hundreds of miles undetected as to their ultimate destination. By the time British intelligence grasped that Virginia was the focus, the Allied armies were already beyond recall. In Philadelphia, the Allied commanders paused briefly to secure supplies and confirm coordination with de Grasse. News arrived that the French fleet had reached the Chesapeake and driven back the British at the Battle of the Capes. Washington, who had long doubted whether he would ever see an opportunity for decisive victory, was elated. The trap was tightening, and his long-sought chance was within reach. On September 5th, the armies resumed their march southward, crossing the Susquehanna River and pressing into Maryland. The logistical demands grew heavier as the columns lengthened and roads worsened. Artillery had to be dragged over rough terrain, bridges constructed for river crossings, and supplies requisitioned from local populations already weary from years of war. Yet the march continued with discipline. Rochambeau's French soldiers, accustomed to rigorous campaigning in Europe, maintained order and impressed American civilians with their punctuality in paying for provisions. The Continental Army, though smaller and less uniformly equipped, demonstrated resilience born of years of hardship. Together, the two armies advanced nearly 450 miles in less than 6 weeks, a pace remarkable for forces burdened with artillery and supply trains. By late September, the Franco-American columns converged on Williamsburg, only a day's march from Yorktown. Here they joined with Lafayette's contingent and the French troops under Saint-Simon, swelling their combined strength to approximately 17,000 men. Washington personally inspected the positions and issued orders for the encirclement of Cornwallis. The armies spread across the Virginia countryside, establishing camps, digging preliminary entrenchments, and preparing artillery. The long march, sustained by deception, discipline, and coordination with naval power, had delivered Washington and Rochambeau to the very doorstep of Cornwallis's defenses. The convergence was not lost on the soldiers themselves. Men who had marched since August now found themselves within sight of their quarry, their hardships channeled into anticipation of a decisive confrontation. French engineers surveyed the ground for siege works, while American soldiers sharpened their entrenching tools. Supplies flowed from the French fleet anchored in the Chesapeake, ensuring that the besieging forces would be well provisioned. Every element of the campaign, deception in New York, the march through the mid-Atlantic, the coordination with de Grasse, had aligned to concentrate overwhelming force at a single point. Cornwallis, entrenched behind earthworks at Yorktown, now faced an enemy larger and better supplied than any he had encountered in the South. The betrayal of expectation that the Royal Navy would secure his position had already left him isolated. The arrival of Washington and Rochambeau's armies transformed that isolation into encirclement. From his redoubts, Cornwallis could see the smoke of Allied campfires spreading across the horizon, a visual reminder that his assumptions of security had collapsed into confinement. The defenses he had constructed with confidence were about to be tested under a siege conducted by engineers, artillery, and troops who had prepared for this moment across months of coordinated movement. The decisive shift in the balance of the American war took place not on land, but at sea, where the French Navy challenged the Royal Navy in waters that Britain had long considered its own. Cornwallis's decision to occupy Yorktown had been predicated on the assumption that British control of the Chesapeake was assured. When the French fleet under Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse entered those waters in late August 1781, that assumption collapsed, and the vulnerability of Cornwallis's position was laid bare. De Grasse's fleet represented the culmination of years of French preparation. The French Navy had been rebuilt in the 1770s after earlier defeats, its ships modernized and its officer corps invigorated. De Grasse himself was an experienced commander who had distinguished himself in Caribbean operations, where the contest for Sugar Islands drew some of the most intense fighting of the wider war. In 1781, he brought 28 ships of the line from Cap Français and Saint-Domingue, a force large enough to confront the Royal Navy directly. With him came over 3,000 troops under the Marquis de Saint-Simon, who were immediately landed near Williamsburg to reinforce Lafayette and prepare for the coming siege. The timing of de Grasse's arrival was critical. Washington and Rochambeau were already marching south, counting on French naval supremacy to trap Cornwallis. Had the Royal Navy intercepted de Grasse before he reached the Chesapeake, the entire campaign might have unraveled. Instead, on August 30th, his fleet dropped anchor in Lynnhaven Bay, closing access to the York and James rivers. French soldiers disembarked, supplies were unloaded, and the Chesapeake became, for the first time in the war, a French-controlled sea. The British response was hurried and uncertain. Admiral Thomas Graves, commanding at New York, had at his disposal 19 ships of the line, reinforced by a squadron under Samuel Hood recently arrived from the Caribbean. Pressured by Clinton to relieve Cornwallis, Graves sailed south in early September. On September 5, 1781, his fleet sighted de Grasse off the Virginia Capes. The two lines of battle maneuvered into position, and by afternoon a running engagement commenced. The Battle of the Capes was not marked by dramatic losses, but its consequences were immense. The British line was poorly coordinated, with signals misunderstood and formations stretched thin. De Grasse, by contrast, maintained cohesion, using his superior numbers to press the engagement. After several hours of cannon fire, neither side had lost a ship, but the British were compelled to withdraw. Graves, his fleet battered and short of ammunition, returned to New York to refit. De Grasse retained command of the Chesapeake, his blockade intact, and Cornwallis's line of relief severed. The importance of this outcome cannot be overstated. For the first time in the war, Britain's naval supremacy had been broken in a decisive theater. Control of the Chesapeake meant that Cornwallis was isolated, his only connection to the wider empire cut off. Supplies, reinforcements, and evacuation all depended on naval access, and with the French fleet entrenched in the bay, none of these could be guaranteed. Clinton, still in New York with nearly 15,000 men, could not march overland through hostile territory, and without naval control he could not send aid by sea. Cornwallis, though fortified at Yorktown, now faced the prospect of a siege without hope of relief. French naval power did more than blockade Cornwallis. It enabled the transport of heavy artillery and siege equipment essential for the operations that Washington and Rochambeau were preparing. Dozens of siege guns, mortars, and entrenching tools were ferried ashore, along with supplies of powder and shot. The Allied armies, whose strength lay in their numbers and discipline, were now supplied with the material necessary to reduce fortified positions. The very presence of de Grasse's fleet guaranteed that these supplies would continue to flow, while Cornwallis's garrison watched their own stores diminish. The blockade extended beyond Yorktown itself. British ships attempting to enter the Chesapeake were driven off or captured, while French patrols scoured the waters to ensure that no relief could reach Cornwallis. The psychological effect was profound. British officers and soldiers, long accustomed to viewing the Royal Navy as a shield, now realized they were cut off. Cornwallis wrote to Clinton requesting urgent assistance, but his dispatches could not alter the reality that control of the sea had shifted. De Grasse's coordination with Washington and Rochambeau was equally decisive. Couriers moved between Williamsburg and the French flagship, ensuring that naval and land operations were synchronized. French engineers ashore planned siege lines with the knowledge that their fleet controlled the waterways behind them. Washington, who had often been forced into defensive postures by lack of resources, now possessed overwhelming advantages. A fleet to block escape, an army to encircle, and artillery to breach defenses. The Royal Navy attempted no immediate second challenge. Clinton and Graves debated a relief expedition but delayed, uncertain of French strength and unwilling to risk another defeat without reinforcements. By the time preparations advanced, Cornwallis's position had deteriorated beyond repair. The fleet that Britain had relied upon as its guarantee of dominance had failed at the moment of greatest need, and the consequences were being felt in the earthworks around Yorktown. Inside Cornwallis's camp, the awareness of naval absence gnawed at confidence. Officers who had expected to see sails on the horizon instead saw French ships patrolling the bay. The prospect of escape by water, once central to British strategy, now seemed impossible. Cornwallis continued to fortify and to prepare for siege, but the knowledge that no reinforcements would arrive created a sense of inevitability. His men, cut off from supply and surrounded by growing numbers of enemies, braced themselves for the attritional struggle that was about to begin. With the Chesapeake secured and French soldiers reinforcing the siege lines, the stage was set for operations that would bring all the weight of Allied artillery against Cornwallis's defenses. The betrayal of expectation at sea had left the British Army in Virginia trapped, and the armies assembling outside Yorktown were ready to exploit that vulnerability with systematic precision. The guns were being placed, the trenches prepared, and the moment was approaching when firepower, not maneuver, would dictate the course of events. By late September 1781, the Allied armies had closed in around Yorktown, their lines stretching from the banks of the York River southward across the peninsula. Washington and Rochambeau, having completed the long march from the Hudson, now commanded nearly 17,000 troops, including French regiments seasoned by European campaigns and American units hardened by 6 years of war. Cornwallis faced them with roughly 8,000 to 9,000 men, British regulars, German auxiliaries, and loyalists, encamped behind earthworks hastily improved under pressure. The stage was set for a formal siege, a type of warfare that drew on precise engineering, heavy artillery, and relentless attrition rather than maneuver in open battle. The geography of Yorktown shaped the siege. The town lay on bluffs overlooking the York River, its streets lined with modest houses, warehouses, and gardens. Cornwallis's defensive perimeter encircled the settlement with a chain of redoubts, batteries, and trenches. Across the river, a smaller detachment fortified Gloucester Point, covering the northern shore and protecting access to the river's mouth. Yet the defenses were imperfect. Several redoubts were incomplete. The soil was sandy and difficult to hold against bombardment, and the perimeter was too long for Cornwallis's reduced numbers to man effectively. French engineers, trained in the methods of Vauban, immediately identified weaknesses that could be exploited by siege operations. The Allies established their headquarters at Williamsburg, only a few miles distant, and began moving artillery and supplies forward. French logistical support proved decisive. Heavy siege guns, 24-pounders, mortars, and howitzers, were unloaded from de Grasse's fleet and hauled to the lines by teams of horses and oxen. American soldiers dug entrenchments day and night, guided by French officers who supervised the construction of parallels. Long, continuous trenches designed to bring artillery closer to enemy defenses. By early October, the Allies were ready to open their first parallel, approximately 600 yards from the British outer works. On the night of October 6, 1781, under cover of darkness, hundreds of soldiers and laborers moved silently into position with shovels and picks. By dawn, a trench nearly a mile in length had been cut into the earth, zigzag approaches connecting it to the rear. Fascines, gabions, and earth were piled high to shield the workers from musket fire. Cornwallis's troops, though aware of the activity, were unable to prevent it. British artillery opened sporadic fire, but the Allies continued digging, and by the following day batteries were being emplaced. The bombardment began on October 9th, when Washington himself touched off the first American cannon. A thunderous roar echoed across the river as round shot crashed into the town. Soon, French batteries joined in, their heavier guns sending shells and red-hot shot into British positions. Houses in Yorktown caught fire, supply depots exploded, and soldiers crowded into trenches for shelter. The constant barrage wore down morale, filling the air with smoke and the smell of burning wood. Cornwallis ordered counter-battery fire, but his guns were outmatched both in number and in caliber. Allied artillery crews, firing with precision, systematically silenced British pieces one by one. As the siege progressed, the Allies extended their works forward. On the night of October 11th, a second parallel was begun, this one only 300 yards from the British lines. Again, thousands of men labored through the night, constructing new trenches under intermittent fire. Cornwallis launched sorties to disrupt the work, the most notable on October 16th, when a force of 350 men stormed Allied trenches and spiked several cannon. The assault gained temporary success but could not halt the steady advance. Within days, the Allied guns were repaired, and the bombardment resumed with even greater intensity. A critical obstacle to the completion of the second parallel was the presence of two advanced British redoubts, numbered 9 and 10, which anchored the outer defenses on the left flank. Unless captured, these positions threatened the security of the siege lines and prevented the Allies from moving their artillery to point-blank range. Washington and Rochambeau resolved to seize them by storm. The assaults were scheduled for the night of October 14th, with American troops under Alexander Hamilton attacking Redoubt 10 and French grenadiers striking Redoubt 9. The attacks unfolded under cover of darkness. At Redoubt 10, Hamilton's men advanced silently with unloaded muskets, carrying bayonets and axes. They cut through abatis, scrambled up earthen walls, and overwhelmed the defenders in close combat. Within minutes, the position was secured, with dozens of British and German soldiers captured. On the French sector, the assault on Redoubt 9 was fiercer, the defenders resisting with musket fire and grenades. After intense fighting, the French broke through, capturing the redoubt and consolidating their hold. The fall of both positions gave the Allies control of the outer defenses and opened the way for their artillery to dominate the British lines. From that point, the bombardment intensified to a degree that made life inside Yorktown nearly unendurable. Allied guns fired day and night, their shells bursting over trenches and within the town itself. Buildings collapsed under the pounding, ammunition wagons exploded, and British casualties mounted. Soldiers and civilians alike crowded into shelters, their rations dwindling and disease spreading. Horses, slaughtered for food, left the garrison without means to move artillery or wagons. The atmosphere was one of relentless pressure, the thunder of cannon accompanied by the knowledge that the enemy's trenches crept closer with every passing hour. Cornwallis's options narrowed as the siege tightened. Attempts to maintain morale grew more difficult as bombardments reduced positions to rubble. His letters to Clinton grew increasingly urgent, but the prospect of relief was distant and uncertain. The defenses of Yorktown, built to withstand attack, were being ground down by the systematic application of siege warfare conducted with precision and overwhelming resources. The redoubts lost on October 14th were only the beginning, for the Allies were preparing to push their artillery even closer, bringing every inch of the British perimeter under direct fire. The experience of Cornwallis's army inside the defenses of Yorktown during October 1781 was defined by a steady descent into deprivation, exhaustion, and despair. What had begun as an orderly encampment, fortified by engineers and supplied by the expectation of naval support, degenerated within weeks into a scene of scarcity and unrelenting pressure. The Franco-American artillery bombardment, intensifying after the capture of the outer redoubts, struck not only military positions, but the fabric of daily life inside the town. The garrison, numbering between 8,000 and 9,000 men, faced immediate shortages once the French fleet closed the Chesapeake. Supplies that had been expected from New York, food, ammunition, tents, and medical provisions, never arrived. Rations dwindled as local stores were consumed, and efforts to forage beyond the lines were prevented by Allied patrols. Soldiers subsisted increasingly on salt pork, hard bread, and what livestock remained, but fodder for animals was nearly exhausted. Horses, once needed to move artillery and wagons, were slaughtered for food, their loss reducing the army's capacity to maneuver or evacuate guns. Disease compounded the hardship. Dysentery spread rapidly through crowded trenches and shelters, fueled by contaminated water and inadequate sanitation. Malaria, endemic in Virginia, afflicted both British and German troops and used to the climate. Wounded men filled improvised hospitals, where the lack of bandages, medicines, and surgeons overwhelmed the capacity for care. Accounts describe soldiers lying in barns and cellars, untreated for days, their suffering magnified by the thunder of artillery outside. Each shell that landed in Yorktown threatened not only military stores but the lives of the sick and injured huddled within. The morale of the garrison reflected these conditions. Officers attempted to maintain order, but the psychological weight of constant bombardment eroded discipline. Men crouched in trenches as shells burst overhead, their nights broken by fire and their days consumed with repair of crumbling defenses. Letters and journals from within the town reveal the strain. The fear of red-hot shot igniting powder magazines, the horror of comrades torn apart by shell fragments, and the gnawing hunger that accompanied every watch. German auxiliaries, hired from Hesse and Brunswick, endured the siege with stoicism but expressed frustration at being trapped in a war that was not their own. Loyalist militia, many of whom had joined with the expectation of British protection, began to lose faith as it became clear that no relief was imminent. The civilian population of Yorktown, though smaller than in peacetime, suffered equally. Families crowded into cellars, their homes splintered by shot. Women and children, who had once sought safety behind British lines, found themselves exposed to the same dangers as soldiers. Fires broke out in the town, spreading from one building to another as shells struck roofs and walls. Efforts to extinguish the flames were hampered by lack of water and the danger of venturing into the open. Civilians scavenged for food alongside soldiers, sharing in the scarcity that united garrison and populace alike in hardship. Cornwallis attempted to sustain the fighting spirit of his army through exhortation and strict discipline. He rotated units in the trenches, ordered sorties against enemy lines, and maintained formal parades when possible. Yet his men could not ignore the reality visible from the parapets. Allied trenches drawing ever closer, batteries multiplying, and French and American soldiers encamped in growing numbers on every side. The roar of Allied artillery, which began on October 9th, became a constant presence, its rhythm breaking only for brief pauses before resuming with greater intensity. Every day the defenses crumbled further, and every night new earthworks appeared closer to the British lines. The artillery inflicted material devastation, as well as psychological strain. British guns, fewer in number and increasingly dismounted by counterfire, struggled to silence the Allied batteries. Powder supplies ran low, forcing economy of fire. Cannon shot was scavenged and reused when possible, but the superiority of the Allied ordnance was overwhelming. French 24-pounders and American mortars maintained a pace of fire that the defenders could not match. Redoubts collapsed under the barrage, embrasures shattered, and defensive positions became increasingly untenable. Soldiers worked through the night to repair breaches, only to see them destroyed again by dawn. As conditions deteriorated, Cornwallis's correspondence with Clinton in New York grew more urgent. He described the shortage of provisions, the scale of bombardment, and the impossibility of holding out indefinitely without relief. Clinton assured him that a fleet was being prepared, but delays in assembling ships and troops meant that help remained weeks away. Cornwallis, aware that time was measured not in weeks but in days of endurance, pressed on with defensive measures. His reliance on relief that never arrived deepened the sense of betrayal felt by his men, who watched the horizon in vain for the sails of the Royal Navy. Inside Yorktown, the atmosphere by mid-October was one of suffocating confinement. The town itself, once a thriving port, was reduced to rubble and ashes. Trenches overflowed with rainwater, supplies dwindled to near nothing, and the constant shelling created a sense of inevitability that no officer's exhortations could dispel. Soldiers continued to man their posts, but conversations in the ranks betrayed doubt and resignation. The defenses, once thought sufficient to withstand a prolonged siege, were being reduced systematically by firepower and engineering. Cornwallis confronted choices that grew narrower each day. To hold the town meant further attrition and collapse. To attempt breakout carried risks against overwhelming opposition. His men, confined and battered, awaited orders while the Allies prepared their next assault. The prospect of relief from the sea had receded into uncertainty, and the conditions within Yorktown deteriorated with every passing hour. The garrison's endurance, already strained, was being tested against pressures that no expectation of imperial strength could offset. By mid-October 1781, Cornwallis had recognized that the siege of Yorktown was pressing toward a critical stage. His outer redoubts had been seized, his lines steadily compressed, and his men subjected to relentless artillery fire. The hope of relief from New York remained uncertain, the Royal Navy absent, and his garrison increasingly debilitated by shortages and disease. Faced with these realities, he turned to the only remaining option that seemed to preserve initiative: an attempt to break out of the tightening ring and escape across the York River. The geography of the peninsula suggested that Gloucester Point, held by a British detachment under Colonel Banastre Tarleton, offered the most feasible route of retreat. Located directly across from Yorktown on the north shore of the river, Gloucester was lightly invested by French cavalry under the Duc de Lauzun and American militia led by John Mercer. If Cornwallis could ferry his troops across during the night, he might overwhelm the small Allied force there, secure the northern bank, and retreat inland toward the open countryside of Virginia. From there, he could seek to march northward, re-establish contact with Clinton, or at the very least prolong the campaign beyond the confines of the besieged town. Cornwallis planned the operation for the night of October 16th. Orders were issued quietly to avoid alerting the besieging forces. Flatboats and barges were assembled along the York River, their crews prepared to shuttle regiments across under cover of darkness. The first wave of infantry began embarking late in the evening, moving silently down to the water's edge while artillery fire rumbled in the distance. By midnight, several detachments had successfully crossed, forming up on the Gloucester side. The operation, precarious but achievable, seemed momentarily within reach. Yet fate and weather combined to thwart the attempt. Shortly after the initial crossings, a violent squall swept down the river, driven by autumn winds off the Chesapeake. Barges were tossed about, several driven downstream, and the coordination of the passage collapsed. Boats laden with soldiers drifted helplessly, some capsizing in the darkness, their occupants struggling in the current. Others were forced back to the Yorktown shore, unable to reach the opposite bank. The storm scattered the effort so completely that Cornwallis, fearing the annihilation of his divided force, ordered the attempt abandoned. Those who had crossed were recalled at great risk, re-embarking under chaotic conditions as dawn approached. By morning, the survivors straggled back into Yorktown, their hopes of escape extinguished. The failed breakout had consequences beyond the immediate loss of opportunity. It drained what remained of morale among the troops, who had clung to the hope that evacuation across the river might yet spare them from confinement. The sight of comrades drowned in the attempt, combined with the futility of the operation, underscored the sense of entrapment. Officers, though still outwardly composed, understood that the garrison was now truly isolated. The soldiers returned to their trenches with the knowledge that their last realistic chance of avoiding the siege's outcome had dissolved in the storm. Cornwallis did not abandon efforts to harass the besiegers. Sorties were mounted from the lines, most notably on the morning of October 16th itself, when a detachment of 350 British troops struck at Allied trenches on the left of the siege works. The sortie was executed with determination, spiking several cannon and briefly disrupting enemy progress. Yet the success was fleeting. The attackers were driven back, leaving dozens killed and wounded, and the Allies quickly repaired the damage. The sortie demonstrated that Cornwallis's troops retained discipline and courage, but it also revealed the imbalance of resources. The besiegers could replace what was destroyed, while the garrison could not replenish its losses. The collapse of the breakout attempt shifted Cornwallis's options toward the narrowest of margins. He continued to send dispatches to Clinton, pleading for relief, but the pace of British preparations in New York lagged far behind the urgency of the situation. Clinton had promised to sail with reinforcements, yet adverse winds, logistical delays, and uncertainty about French naval strength kept the fleet in harbor. Cornwallis, confined within earshot of enemy trenches, had no means of influencing these delays. His officers watched the besiegers complete their parallels and prepare new batteries, knowing that each passing day tightened the stranglehold. Inside Yorktown, the failed escape deepened the atmosphere of resignation. Soldiers who had risked their lives in the river crossing recounted the terror of the storm, reinforcing the belief that chance itself had turned against them. German auxiliaries grumbled openly about the futility of continued resistance, while loyalist units despaired at the absence of promised reinforcements. Even among the regulars, confidence in imperial power gave way to grim endurance. The thunder of artillery, resumed with undiminished intensity after the sortie, marked the futility of further resistance. Cornwallis continued to project determination, yet his letters reveal an awareness of impending collapse. He informed Clinton that his defenses were crumbling, his casualties mounting, and his supplies exhausted. The very act of writing these appeals underscored his dependence on external rescue, a rescue that had failed to materialize. The failure of the breakout attempt made clear that the garrison's fate was no longer in its own hands, but in the decisions of distant commanders and the outcome of battles beyond the horizon. The besieging armies, emboldened by their unbroken progress, tightened their grip. French and American soldiers extended their trenches closer to the British lines, their batteries prepared to deliver fire from nearly point-blank range. The sound of pick and shovel in the night reminded the garrison that the enemy advanced steadily, regardless of sorties or storms. The knowledge that the besiegers would soon be able to breach the inner defenses left Cornwallis confronting choices that narrowed with each passing hour, while his soldiers braced themselves for a bombardment unlike any they had yet endured. After the failed attempt to escape across the York River, Cornwallis's garrison braced itself for what all inside the lines understood was coming: the systematic destruction of the town's defenses through concentrated artillery fire. By the third week of October, the Franco-American armies had completed their second parallel and secured the key redoubts that anchored the British perimeter. This allowed siege guns to be dragged to within a few hundred yards of the works, placing every bastion, trench, and shelter in Yorktown under the direct fire of dozens of heavy cannon and mortars. The Allied artillery park by this stage had grown into one of the most formidable concentrations of firepower seen in the war. More than 100 siege pieces were positioned along the parallels: 24-pounder and 18-pounder guns, massive mortars capable of lobbing explosive shells, and howitzers designed to plunge fire over parapets. French engineering skill under officers such as Jean-Baptiste de Chastellux and Baron de Viaminal ensured that the batteries were placed with mathematical precision, each aimed at a selected point in the British defenses. American officers, including Henry Knox, oversaw their continental counterparts, who worked alongside French gunners in manning the pieces. The bombardment began in earnest on October 14th, immediately after the storming of redoubts 9 and 10, and it did not relent. Day and night, the sky over Yorktown flashed with fire as Allied guns hurled shot and shell. The thunder of cannon was constant, echoing across the river and reverberating in the bluffs. Round shot tore through parapets, collapsing earthworks and dismounting British guns. Mortar shells exploded within the town, igniting buildings and sending splinters in all directions. The defenders, unable to match the weight of fire, crouched in their trenches or sought cover in cellars, while their own artillery fell silent one after another. Inside the British lines, the devastation was visible everywhere. Redoubts were flattened, gun emplacements destroyed, and trenches filled with the bodies of men struck by shell fragments. Entire buildings in Yorktown burned to the ground, their embers lighting the night sky. The constant bombardment left no respite. Soldiers who attempted to rest were jolted awake by explosions, while officers struggled to maintain order among men worn down by hunger, fatigue, and the psychological strain of confinement under fire. Ammunition stocks dwindled so rapidly that Cornwallis ordered extreme economy, his guns firing only in response to immediate threats. Cornwallis himself was nearly struck during the bombardment. Reports described shells landing close to his headquarters, forcing him to relocate to a more secure position. His officers, likewise, shifted their posts repeatedly as fire destroyed shelters. Casualties mounted each day, not only killed and wounded, but also men incapacitated by exhaustion or illness. The medical services of the garrison were overwhelmed, surgeons working without sufficient bandages or medicines, their improvised hospitals filling with the groans of men shattered by artillery. For the Allied forces, the bombardment was both destructive and symbolic. American soldiers, many of whom had endured years of retreat and hardship, exulted in the sight of British works collapsing under their fire. French troops, trained in the art of siegecraft, executed the bombardment with the discipline of seasoned professionals. Washington and Rochambeau observed from advanced positions, watching as each salvo drew the lines of destruction closer to the heart of the defenses. Every hour of fire not only reduced the physical capacity of the garrison to resist, but also eroded its will. Cornwallis attempted countermeasures. On the night of October 15th, a detachment of British troops launched a sortie against Allied batteries, spiking several guns before being driven back with heavy loss. The success was fleeting. Within hours, the pieces were repaired, and the bombardment resumed with redoubled intensity. Each effort to disrupt the siege proved temporary, while every day that passed tightened the noose. Cornwallis's engineers patched parapets and raised new traverses, but the pace of Allied fire rendered these efforts increasingly futile. By October 17th, the situation had grown desperate. Nearly all British guns had been silenced, ammunition stocks were nearly exhausted, and the town itself was reduced to ruins. Fires burned unchecked, spreading from building to building as defenders lacked the water and energy to extinguish them. Horses had long since been slaughtered, their carcasses consumed, leaving the garrison immobile. Disease spread unchecked, the combination of filth, hunger, and exposure producing misery across the ranks. For soldiers and civilians alike, the experience was one of unrelenting terror, each explosion a reminder that no refuge remained secure. The final bombardment was not simply the prelude to an assault. It was a process designed to grind the defenders into submission. Washington, guided by French engineers, had no intention of wasting lives on a storming of the inner works, so long as artillery could achieve the same end. The Allied guns fired without pause, their crews working in shifts to maintain a ceaseless rhythm. By the third week of October, the British lines were breached in several places, and the town itself resembled a smoldering ruin. Cornwallis faced the prospect of collapse, his garrison unable to withstand another sustained day of fire. The psychological impact of the bombardment was as decisive as the physical destruction. Men who had once believed in the invincibility of British arms now whispered of surrender. German auxiliaries murmured that their service contract did not include certain death in a hopeless defense. Loyalists, who had tied their fortunes to imperial success, despaired at the absence of the navy. Officers, though outwardly composed, confided to one another that the army could not endure another week of such punishment. Cornwallis himself remained outwardly determined, but understood the scale of the disaster closing around him. As the smoke of the bombardment thickened over Yorktown, Cornwallis convened his staff to consider options. The possibility of another breakout was debated, but rejected as impractical given the exhausted state of the troops and the absence of boats. Continued resistance seemed likely only to result in further bloodshed without altering the outcome. Yet to surrender an entire British field army was a decision of immense weight, one that carried consequences not only for his men but for the empire itself. Cornwallis hesitated, but the crumbling defenses and the cries of the wounded pressed the matter toward a decision that could not be deferred much longer. On the morning of October 17th, after several nights of sleepless bombardment and the failure of every attempt to reverse the siege, a white flag appeared above the British lines at Yorktown. Cornwallis, aware that his defenses were collapsing and that further resistance would mean unnecessary slaughter, authorized his staff to seek terms of capitulation. The signal was received by the Franco-American commanders, who immediately suspended fire. After nearly 10 days of relentless cannonade, the silence that followed was striking, a sudden absence of thunder that underscored the magnitude of the decision now before both armies. Cornwallis requested a ceasefire to allow negotiations. Washington, cautious of delay or duplicity, agreed only to a brief suspension while commissioners from both sides met to discuss conditions. On October 18th, representatives gathered at the Moore House, a modest residence just outside the Allied lines. The British were represented by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Dundas and Major Alexander Ross, the Allies by Colonel John Laurens, an aide to Washington, and the Marquis de Noailles, representing the French. The atmosphere was formal but tense, as both sides understood the gravity of the event. Nearly 8,000 British and German soldiers, along with Loyalist auxiliaries, stood on the brink of capitulation. The Allies demanded unconditional surrender, modeled on the precedent set at Charleston in 1780 when the British had imposed harsh terms on the Americans. Cornwallis, unwilling to subject his army to such humiliation, resisted. He pressed for terms that would permit his men to march out with honors of war, flags flying, bayonets fixed, and drums beating. Washington, mindful of the symbolic importance of the occasion and determined to emphasize the reversal of fortunes, refused. The negotiations stretched late into the evening before compromise was reached. The British would lay down their arms without honors of war, their troops becoming prisoners of the Allied forces. Officers would be permitted to retain their sidearms and personal baggage, while the soldiers would be marched into captivity. Loyalist militia would be left to the discretion of American authorities, a stipulation that filled many with dread. Cornwallis himself avoided appearing at the surrender ceremony, citing illness. Whether genuine or an effort to spare himself personal humiliation remains debated, but his absence became one of the most remarked-upon features of the event. In his stead, he appointed his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, to carry out the formalities. Washington, informed of Cornwallis's decision, instructed that his own second, Major General Benjamin Lincoln, receive the surrender, an intentional gesture recalling Lincoln's humiliation at Charleston, when he had been forced to yield to Cornwallis's superior officers. On the afternoon of October 19, 1781, the surrender ceremony unfolded. British and German troops emerged from their entrenchments and marched onto a field between the opposing armies. Their ranks, depleted and exhausted, stretched for nearly a mile. Many soldiers carried scars of the siege, their uniforms torn, their faces drawn from hunger and fatigue. Drummers beat a subdued march as the men stacked their arms, muskets, bayonets, and colors, under the watch of American and French troops arrayed in orderly lines. Accounts describe the silence among the Allies, broken only by commands and the clatter of weapons being grounded. General O'Hara, leading the procession, first approached Rochambeau, hoping to yield to the French commander. Rochambeau, recognizing the protocol, directed him to Washington. Washington, standing nearby, refused to receive the surrender directly and pointed instead to General Lincoln. O'Hara presented the sword of surrender to Lincoln, who accepted it on behalf of the Franco-American alliance. The symbolism was unmistakable. An American general, once humiliated at Charleston, now received the surrender of Britain's most significant field army in North America. The formalities concluded with the signing of the Articles of Capitulation. Cornwallis's troops became prisoners of war, their officers paroled on condition of not serving again until exchanged. Nearly 8,000 soldiers laid down their arms, along with more than 200 artillery pieces, vast stores of ammunition and supplies. The captured men were divided between French and American custody, with many marched to camps in Virginia and Maryland. German auxiliaries, bound by treaties with their home states, faced internment alongside their British counterparts. Loyalist civilians and militia, excluded from the protections granted to regulars, faced an uncertain fate, many fleeing with whatever belongings they could carry. The scene at Yorktown resonated beyond the battlefield. For Washington's troops, the ceremony was the culmination of years of hardship. Men who had endured Valley Forge, Monmouth, and countless smaller engagements now witnessed the surrender of a major British army. French soldiers, many of whom had crossed the Atlantic for this very campaign, celebrated the vindication of their nation's investment. The symbolism of Franco-American cooperation was unmistakable, with both flags raised over the captured works. For the British soldiers, the march to surrender was an experience of humiliation and despair. They had fought with discipline and endured the hardships of siege, only to lay down their arms before an enemy they had long considered inferior. Officers, though permitted to retain their swords, faced the bitter task of leading men into captivity. The absence of their commander at the ceremony compounded the sense of abandonment felt by many in the ranks. Cornwallis, remaining in his quarters, avoided the immediate spectacle but could not escape its consequences. His decision to yield preserved the lives of his men, sparing them further slaughter under bombardment. But it also consigned him to history as the general who surrendered the largest British force of the American War. His correspondence with Clinton made clear his bitterness at the failure of naval relief and the inadequacy of imperial support. Yet these explanations could not erase the image of stacked muskets and grounded colors on the Yorktown field. As the British troops were marched away to captivity, the guns that had battered Yorktown fell silent, their smoke still lingering over the ruins of the town. The Allies began dismantling the siege works, while Washington and Rochambeau considered the next steps of the wider war. Cornwallis, confined to his quarters, prepared his reports for London, knowing that the repercussions of this capitulation would reverberate across the empire. The surrender ceremony itself was only the outward expression of a deeper collapse, one that Parliament and the British public would soon confront in debates over the future of the war. News of the capitulation at Yorktown reached Britain weeks after the event, carried across the Atlantic by dispatch vessels. The delay did little to soften the blow. When the reports arrived in London in late November 1781, they struck the government, Parliament, and public with a force that reflected not only the scale of the loss, but also the symbolism of the defeat. Cornwallis's surrender meant the capture of nearly 8,000 British and German soldiers, an entire field army delivered into enemy hands. More than a century of imperial expansion had accustomed Britain to victories overseas. Yorktown confronted it with the reality of vulnerability. The initial reaction within the government of Lord North was one of disbelief. North, who had presided over the war effort since 1770, reportedly staggered in shock upon hearing the news, exclaiming that it was all over, though he quickly suppressed the words in front of his colleagues. His administration had staked its credibility on the suppression of the rebellion, and Cornwallis's defeat undermined every argument that had been advanced to justify continued war. The financial costs had already strained Britain, with wartime expenditure exceeding £100 million and the national debt ballooning to unprecedented levels. Yorktown suggested that no further investment of treasure or blood could restore the colonies by force. Parliamentary debate intensified immediately. Opposition leaders such as Charles James Fox and Edmund Burke, who had long condemned the war as mismanaged and unjust, seized on the disaster as vindication of their warnings. They pointed to the folly of relying on loyalist support in the South, the overconfidence in naval superiority, and the government's failure to concentrate resources effectively. The surrender of Cornwallis became a rallying cry for demands to end the conflict, though ministers resisted admitting that the war in America was irretrievable. The press echoed the shock and anger felt across the country. Newspapers carried accounts of the capitulation, often accompanied by exaggerated rumors of British weakness and American strength. Pamphleteers denounced the government's incompetence, while satirists ridiculed the contrast between Cornwallis's reputation as a skilled commander and his inability to hold out at Yorktown. Public meetings in cities such as London, Bristol, and Edinburgh passed resolutions calling for peace. Merchants, whose trade with America had collapsed under the weight of blockade and rebellion, pressed for an end to hostilities that had ruined their livelihoods. The loss reverberated beyond the realm of politics. Military officers, many of whom had served in North America or had comrades in Cornwallis's army, reflected on the implications for Britain's standing in the world. The surrender was not simply a battlefield reverse, but a demonstration that Britain's global system of power could be challenged and overturned by a coalition of insurgents and European rivals. The myth of unbroken naval supremacy, punctured at the Battle of the Capes, was now replaced with anxiety over French and Spanish advances elsewhere. Reports from the Caribbean described British garrisons stretched thin against superior enemy fleets, while news from India hinted at mounting challenges from indigenous powers supported by European rivals. Within the army itself, the effect was demoralizing. Officers in garrisons from Gibraltar to Jamaica read of Yorktown with apprehension, aware that reinforcements would now be diverted or delayed. Soldiers' families at home worried about relatives captured in Virginia, whose fate remained uncertain. The capture of so many prisoners presented Britain with logistical and diplomatic challenges, for the exchange of such numbers was unlikely to favor the empire. Cornwallis's army, once considered a decisive instrument, had vanished from the order of battle. The king, George III, received the news with characteristic resolve. He insisted privately that the loss of one army did not alter Britain's determination to continue the struggle, and he encouraged his ministers to prepare for renewed efforts in America. Yet even the monarch could not prevent the erosion of political will. In the Commons, motions were introduced to censure the government and to demand negotiation with the Americans. By March 1782, Lord North's administration collapsed under the pressure, replaced by a ministry more willing to explore peace. The sense of betrayal lingered throughout these debates. Many in Britain had believed that the colonies could not sustain prolonged resistance without foreign aid, and that once the French were checked, rebellion would wither. Yorktown revealed the fragility of those assumptions. The Royal Navy, presumed to be the guarantor of imperial security, had failed to secure the Chesapeake. Loyalist support, advertised as the cornerstone of Southern strategy, had proved insufficient. Cornwallis, regarded as one of Britain's ablest generals, had been left isolated and compelled to surrender. Each of these failures combined into a narrative that eroded confidence in imperial management. The financial implications deepened the crisis. Britain's credit, though resilient, was strained by the need to finance operations not only in America, but also in the Caribbean, India, and Europe. The loss of Cornwallis's army meant additional expenditures for recruitment, transport, and defense of vulnerable outposts. Taxation at home weighed heavily on the population, with discontent simmering in both rural and urban areas. The prospect of prolonging the war with reduced prospects of success became increasingly untenable. Diplomatic consequences also followed swiftly. France, buoyed by the victory, pressed its advantage in negotiations with Spain and in operations across the Atlantic. The Dutch, already at war with Britain, found encouragement in the spectacle of imperial weakness. Across Europe, rival courts observed that Britain, though still formidable, had suffered a blow from which its authority could not easily recover. The balance of power was shifting, and Britain's ability to dictate terms on the continent was undermined by its vulnerability overseas. Amid the shock and recrimination, one fact remained clear to contemporaries. The surrender at Yorktown had altered the trajectory of the war. Britain still commanded large armies and fleets, but its political class was deeply divided, its public weary of sacrifice, and its merchants clamoring for restored access to transatlantic markets. Cornwallis's capitulation did not immediately end the conflict, but it rendered arguments for pursuing it far more difficult to sustain. Parliament's debates, the press's criticisms, and the merchants' petitions all converged on a single demand: a reconsideration of imperial strategy. Yet the empire's focus did not disappear with America. Even as Britain grappled with the consequences of Yorktown, its gaze turned increasingly toward other theaters: India, the Caribbean, and Ireland, where the struggle for influence and control continued. The surrender that had shaken Parliament did not signal an imperial retreat from the world, but a redirection of effort, one that would carry Cornwallis himself into new assignments abroad. The capitulation at Yorktown did not close the book on the Anglo-American conflict, but it transformed the diplomatic and strategic landscape of the early 1780s. Britain still retained formidable resources, yet the surrender of Cornwallis's army stripped its cause in America of credibility. With one of its most experienced generals compelled to yield and nearly 8,000 men marched into captivity, the government in London found its position weakened both at home and abroad. Across the Atlantic world, adversaries and allies alike recalculated their policies in light of the new balance of power. The most immediate consequence was the acceleration of diplomatic negotiations. Even before Yorktown, France and Spain had been urging Britain toward concessions through pressure on multiple fronts. With Cornwallis's defeat, those pressures gained weight. In 1782, representatives of the American Congress, led by Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, John Jay, and Henry Laurens, entered into talks with British envoys in Paris. Although the war would formally continue for nearly 2 more years, the groundwork for peace was laid in the shadow of the Virginia surrender. The eventual Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, recognized the independence of the United States, ceded vast territories stretching to the Mississippi, and reshaped the map of North America. Britain's response to this loss was not uniform despair. While Parliament conceded the impossibility of restoring the 13 colonies by force, many policymakers turned their attention to safeguarding other parts of the empire. The Caribbean islands, vital for their sugar production, became an even higher priority, defended vigorously against French and Spanish incursions. In India, the East India Company's possessions were reinforced, with men and ships diverted from the Atlantic theater. Britain's imperial system, though shaken, adapted by refocusing on regions that offered greater strategic and economic advantage than the rebellious colonies had ever provided. For France, the victory at Yorktown validated years of investment in the American cause. French soldiers who had marched beside Washington and Rochambeau returned home with enhanced prestige, and the Navy's triumph at the Battle of the Capes demonstrated the fruits of naval reform. Yet the cost had been immense. By some estimates, France had spent over 1.3 billion livres supporting the war, a financial strain that deepened the fiscal crisis of the Bourbon monarchy. While Yorktown secured American independence, it also accelerated the internal pressures that, within a decade, would contribute to the outbreak of the French Revolution. Spain, allied with France since 1779, pursued its own objectives, particularly the recovery of Gibraltar and Florida. Although Yorktown weakened Britain, it did not yield Gibraltar, which withstood a massive siege until 1783. Spain did regain Florida in the peace settlement, yet the larger goal of driving Britain from its Mediterranean stronghold remained unfulfilled. The global conflict, sparked in part by the American Rebellion, revealed the complexity of European rivalries, with each power seeking to exploit Britain's distraction while securing its own interests. For the United States, the wider consequences were profound. Independence was no longer a distant aspiration, but a reality that required governance, diplomacy, and consolidation. The Continental Army, though weary and often unpaid, had secured recognition on the battlefield, strengthening Washington's position as a national figure. The alliance with France, though temporary in its objectives, had demonstrated the capacity of the new republic to operate within a global diplomatic framework. Yet challenges remained. Debt burdened the states, loyalist populations required management, and the western frontier presented both opportunity and conflict. Cornwallis himself, though tarnished by Yorktown, remained a figure of significance in Britain's imperial future. Far from ending his career, the disaster in Virginia redirected it. In 1786, he was appointed Governor-General of Bengal, tasked with reforming the East India Company's administration and defending its possessions against Mysore and Maratha power. His tenure in India witnessed both military campaigns and administrative innovations, establishing him as a central figure in Britain's Eastern Empire. Later, in the 1790s, he served as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, confronting rebellion and navigating the turbulent politics of union with Britain. Yorktown, rather than erasing his reputation, bound it permanently to the trajectory of imperial redirection. The British Army, too, absorbed lessons from the war. The reliance on loyalist support in America, the limitations of operating in vast and hostile terrain, and the vulnerability of overseas campaigns to naval defeat all shaped future doctrine. The experience underscored the necessity of securing maritime supremacy before committing large forces inland. In later wars of the 18th and 19th centuries, Britain would apply these lessons with greater discipline, ensuring that no field army would again be stranded as Cornwallis's had been. The wider Atlantic world felt the aftershocks. Caribbean colonies experienced intensified conflict as France and Britain contested islands such as St. Lucia, Dominica, and Jamaica. Naval clashes in the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean further demonstrated that the struggle was not confined to North America. The American victory, achieved with European assistance, was part of a global redistribution of power, one that reshaped trade routes, colonial ambitions, and the strategic priorities of empires. At home in Britain, the loss of the colonies forced a reckoning with imperial identity. The argument that colonies existed primarily for trade rather than direct governance gained ground, influencing policy toward Canada, the Caribbean, and India. The empire did not contract but shifted, focusing on commercial exploitation and maritime connectivity rather than territorial control in North America. This adaptation would prove decisive in the coming century, as Britain expanded in Asia and Africa while maintaining dominance of global shipping. Yet amid these recalibrations, the memory of Yorktown remained vivid. The surrender of 1781 symbolized both the vulnerability of empire and the resilience of insurgent movements supported by international coalitions. It revealed that logistical miscalculation, overconfidence in naval power, and reliance on fragile political assumptions could undo even the most experienced commanders. For contemporaries, it marked not just a defeat but a turning of the imperial tide, redirecting Britain's energies and shaping the course of American independence. As debates unfolded in London, and as Britain refocused its imperial strategy elsewhere, the image of Cornwallis's men marching out to lay down their arms lingered. It was a scene that haunted ministers and inspired opponents of the war, a reminder that the empire's reach was not unlimited. Yet the consequences did not stop with parliament or diplomacy. The surrender became part of a broader historical narrative that defined Britain's loss of America and raised questions about the legacy of command, loyalty, and the future direction of imperial ambition. The events at Yorktown left a mark that extended beyond the military disaster of October 1781. For Britain, America, and the wider world, the capitulation became a defining symbol of the limits of imperial might and the transformative power of alliances. For Cornwallis himself, it was both a personal burden and an episode that shaped the remainder of his career, attaching his name permanently to the loss of Britain's mainland American colonies. In Britain's collective memory, Yorktown came to embody a rupture in imperial confidence. The surrender of a full army, nearly 8,000 British and German troops, was unprecedented in the context of 18th-century warfare. Unlike defeats at Saratoga or Bunker Hill, Yorktown involved the capitulation of a force that had been regarded as disciplined, professional, and led by one of the Crown's most able commanders. The British public, long accustomed to victories in the Caribbean, India, and Europe, found itself confronted with the stark image of soldiers stacking muskets in front of Franco-American lines. The humiliation resonated not only as a tactical failure, but as a betrayal of the belief that the Royal Navy and the Redcoat could secure Britain's global supremacy under any conditions. For the Americans, Yorktown became the proof that independence could be secured not simply through endurance, but through victory. Washington's ability to coordinate French support and execute a complex siege gave his army legitimacy in the eyes of Europe. Veterans who had suffered years of privation recalled Yorktown as vindication of their sacrifice. The surrender was celebrated in towns and villages across the former colonies, becoming part of the mythology of independence alongside declarations, assemblies, and the signing of peace. Yet it also carried a lesson that American survival had depended on external support, and that future security would require diplomacy as well as military strength. French memory of Yorktown was no less significant. Officers who had crossed the Atlantic, Rochambeau, de Grasse, Saint-Simon, returned with reputations enhanced, their service celebrated in Versailles. The campaign was presented as a triumph of French arms over Britain, evidence that the reforms of the Navy and the Army had restored France to great power status. Yet beneath the pride lay the immense financial cost, one that strained the monarchy's ability to maintain solvency. Yorktown could be invoked as a victory of honor, but it also deepened the fiscal imbalance that within a decade would destabilize France itself. Cornwallis's personal legacy was bound most tightly to Yorktown. Critics in Parliament and pamphleteers alike cast him as the general who surrendered America, even though the broader failures of strategy and policy far exceeded any single commander's responsibility. His decision to entrench at Yorktown, his reliance on naval relief, and his failed breakout attempt all came under scrutiny. But contemporaries acknowledged that he had been placed in an impossible situation by circumstances beyond his control. His later appointments in India and Ireland suggested that the crown did not hold him wholly culpable. Yet in popular imagination his name became synonymous with capitulation. Portraits of the surrender often depicted him, though absent in reality from the ceremony, as the figure handing over the sword. The broader imperial legacy of Yorktown was one of recalibration. Britain did not abandon its empire but redirected it. The loss of the 13 colonies spurred intensified efforts in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. Commercial networks were restructured to compensate for the absence of American markets, and military doctrine absorbed the lesson that overseas armies could not be sustained without secure command of the sea. The empire contracted geographically in one sphere only to expand in another, but Yorktown remained the moment when expansion was checked and forced into redirection. In America, Yorktown's memory became foundational to national identity. The battlefield was preserved in local memory as a site of liberation, where ordinary soldiers alongside French allies had forced the surrender of an imperial power. In later generations, ceremonies and commemorations transformed the site into a symbol of unity between America and France, and of the endurance of Republican ideals. The figure of Washington, mounted on horseback observing the surrender, entered into national iconography. His reputation elevated to that of a leader not only of a rebellion, but of a victorious war. Internationally, the legacy of Yorktown extended into the politics of revolution and independence. Observers in Europe, the Caribbean, and Latin America noted that a colonial uprising had succeeded against a great power, aided by alliances but carried by local determination. The example contributed to the climate of unrest that would in later decades encourage revolutions in France, Haiti, and Spanish America. Yorktown was not simply a battlefield victory, but a demonstration that imperial control was not immutable. The shadow it cast over Cornwallis himself was lasting. In India, where he implemented reforms and fought the Mysore Wars, his achievements were substantial, yet his reputation at home remained tempered by the memory of Virginia. In Ireland, where he managed rebellion and union, he was regarded as competent and pragmatic, yet Yorktown trailed him in public perception. His career illustrates the complexity of imperial service. A general who surrendered one colony became the architect of expansion in another. The wider meaning of Yorktown extended into questions of loyalty, expectation, and betrayal. The loyalists who had placed their faith in British protection discovered that their trust had been misplaced, many of them exiled or left to uncertain futures. British soldiers who had believed the Royal Navy invincible endured captivity because that invincibility had failed. Cornwallis, who had relied on assurances from Clinton and London, found himself abandoned by delays and miscommunication. Yorktown symbolized the collapse not of courage or discipline, but of assumptions that had guided imperial policy for decades. Yet the surrender was not an ending point. It reshaped the trajectory of Britain's empire, altered the identity of America, strained the monarchy of France, and provided a reference for revolutionary movements elsewhere. Its legacy was carried not only in treaties and commemorations, but in the shifting strategies of empires that adjusted their priorities in the aftermath. Yorktown's memory continued to reverberate long after the smoke cleared from the Virginia Peninsula, as nations and commanders alike measured their choices against the lessons embedded in that day of capitulation.